How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 65th video on the channel, and today we're looking at Sigmund Freud's 1915 essay, Drives and Vicissitudes. As the title suggests, it's here that Freud developed many of the central concepts that will come to define his drive theory, like those of a pressure, aim, object, and source. Although some elements of his paper would not stand the test of time, notably the relationship between drives and representation, this is in many ways quite an essential work, illuminating quite a murky element of psychoanalysis. As a little aside, I'll be using the translation found in the standard edition, although, for consistency's sake, I've replaced the word instinct with drive in most cases. Additionally, as a bit of a warning, quite a bit of this video deals with sexual topics. Without further ado, let's get into it. Freud begins by introducing what makes the concept of a drive so elusive. Essentially, he says, science always aims to build itself up on the basis of clearly defined concepts, those that are exact or precise. However, this ideal can never be reached in actuality. Instead, we must first work with relatively abstract and nebulous ideas that match up with empirical material or observations. Only later can these be clarified and given more specific definitions, although even then, we have to be careful about avoiding too much rigidity, a lesson taught again and again by other domains, like physics. In Freud's eyes, drives are perfect examples of these basic concepts, being both indispensable and obscure when it comes to psychoanalysis. His goal here is thus to basically explore some of their many characteristics in order to bring them closer to the light, starting with their relationship with physiology. As shown in this diagram, we find in the field the notion of stimuli and reflexes. Something from the outside, like being hit of a knee, triggers something to the outside, a sudden movement. In the process, what is stimulated essentially seeks to remove itself from the source of a disturbance. For Freud, the drives fall in the category of stimuli, with the caveat that they can't be equated with them. The reason why lies in two main attributes, namely, drives are always only internal and constant, whilst many other stimuli are external and come into effect intermittently. For example, hunger is always building, whilst a bright light making you blink only persists as long as it's on. It's this that pushes Freud to describe drives as needs that require satisfaction, where the only true way to get rid of them is death, an idea that will become very important in later works, like Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Shifting gears a bit, it's with this that Freud turns his attention towards the division between the outside and the inside of an organism. As he explains, this is only developed through the division between external stimuli and internal drives. Things that can be escaped via flight are ascribed to the outer world, whilst those that can't due to a constant pressure are identified as belonging to the inner one. To borrow his words,
the perceptual substance of the living organism will thus have found in the efficacy of its muscular activity a basis for distinguishing between an outside and an inside.
Having now looked at drives from a physiological perspective, there's a set of features that particularly stand out. For example, their source finds its origin inside the body, they constantly build up, and there's no way, excluding death, to escape them. However, this isn't quite enough. There are also a number of postulates that are central to any understanding of this basic concept. At this point, Freud singles out a biological element, namely that the nervous system is an apparatus that always seeks to minimize the stimuli that act on it, something we explored in our first Freud Friday episode on his project for scientific psychology. For external physiological stimuli, there's no problem. The nervous system makes use of its muscular movements to flee the disturbance. Drives, however, can't be dealt with through the same mechanism. Instead, as shown here, they must undertake a myriad of interconnected actions that make a change in the external world. To give an example, look at eating an apple. All sorts of complex things have to be accomplished in order to complete this activity, far surpassing reflexes in complexity. However, it's all necessary in order to stave off hunger. In this way, drives are seen by Freud to be the force behind the complex development of a nervous system itself. Ending this section, he explains that pleasure is likely linked to low levels of stimulation, with unpleasure being the inverse. Accordingly, adherence to his famous pleasure principle is one of the defining features of a nervous system itself, though he nuances this a bit by saying that the relationship is quite indefinite and in need of further study. Moving on, Freud says that a biological account of mental life shows us that drives exist on the frontier between the body and the mental, as he himself puts it.
A drive appears as the psychical representative of the stimuli originating from within the organism and reaching the mind.
With this in mind, we get to the next section of the text, where Freud's focus falls squarely on four central terms linked to drives: pressure, aim, object, and source. The first of these essentially defines their essence. Pressure is what pushes us to satisfy them, like the pangs we experience when hungry. The second, on the other hand, is the goal that pressure sets for us, satisfaction itself. Freud distinguishes between ultimate aims and intermediate ones. The former are unchanging. The aim is to do away with hunger, for instance. For the latter, though, there's a bit more leeway in the sense that these are the many different paths to reach the ultimate aim. For example, maybe you specifically crave an apple or pizza, something that ties into the third element that defines drives: objects. These are the most variable part of any drive. Freud defines them as the things through which drives are able to accomplish their aim, stressing that they aren't intrinsically tied to any specific one, but rather get haphazardly fitted in based on whether or not they can lead to satisfaction. Connecting to the title, objects often change over time due to the vicissitudes or shifts that drives undertake through our lives. In this diagram, we can see some of the objects of what he will call the sexual drives, which are linked to psychosexual development, like the breast and the anus. When it comes to their dynamics, Freud outlines two major operations linked to objects: fixation, where they and their drives become glued together so as to almost entirely stop any change from occurring, and confluence, where the same object satisfies multiple aims. Moving on, the fourth and final set of defining elements connected to drives are sources. These are a bit outside of the purview of psychoanalysis, since they are the body processes that produce pressure in the first place. At the end of the day, though, this isn't too much of a problem. To take directly from the text,
Although drives are wholly determined by their origin in a somatic source, in mental life we know them only by their aims. An exact knowledge of the sources of a drive is not invariably necessary.
having set some groundwork, we can now look at the different kinds of drives identified by Freud during this stage in his theorizing. The two primary categories he pinpoints are sexual drives and ego drives, as the latter deal with self-preservation. Freud is quick to stress that this division is only a working hypothesis, indeed changing quite a bit towards the end of his life. The reason why he posits this duality lies in the psychoanalytic study of maladies like hysteria and obsessional neurosis, which found that conflicts between sexuality and the ego, or self, play major roles in their composition. He's fully aware of the fact that the examination of other conditions, such as schizophrenia, might reveal some flaws in this formula. However, at the end of the day, those aren't the things he, or most of his colleagues, usually deal with. It's with this in mind that Freud now turns to the basis of distinguishing between the two sets of drives. In his eyes, it's not all that valuable to try to separate them on a psychological basis. Instead, he falls back on the biology of his day, which held sexuality to be separate from other functions. As he explains, it goes beyond individuals themselves and is necessary for the preservation of a species. To borrow Freud's own words, one way of viewing sexuality holds that
The individual is a temporary and transient appendage to the quasi-immortal germ-plasm, which is entrusted to him by the process of generation.
At this point, Freud explains that the dynamics of the drives are most clear when they aren't functioning correctly. Because of the sorts of issues that psychoanalysis traditionally focuses on, it's thus the case that only rarely the sexual drives are well developed theoretically. These, in his eyes at least, come from a diverse array of organic sources and only fuse together relatively late in development. This synthesis is where they become obviously sexual, as opposed to the more oblique cases found in the first few psychosexual stages. Adding another layer of complexity is the fact that they can sometimes be employed in activities that are far from being clearly sexual in nature, through what Freud calls sublimation, one of the vicissitudes he outlines here, but doesn't develop. The other three main vicissitudes involve 1. The reversal of a drive into its opposite, 2. Turning back onto the subject's ego, and 3. Repression. The first two are what he seeks to examine here, given all the attention already afforded to the last. As can be seen in this diagram, there are a couple characteristics that define reversal. Namely, it involves causing drives to either shift from being active to passive, or to invert their content. These two processes are seen by Freud to be separate, and therefore deserving of individual attention. The first type of reversal can be found in things like sadism and masochism, or scopophilia, a fetish dealing with watching, and exhibitionism. With both pairs, you start with an active aim, to torture or to watch, and have reversed into a passive form, to be tortured or to be watched. The second type of reversal, on the other hand, is a bit different. Here, we find love itself being transformed into hate, whilst the aim remains the same. Extending our scope to include the second category of vicissitudes, sadism and masochism again offer quite a good case study.
The turning around of a drive upon the subject's own self is made plausible by the reflection that masochism is actually sadism turned around on the subject's own ego.
So, whilst the first form of reversal concerns aims, what I'll call reflexivity from now on involves a change in objects. This variety of masochism, if we can even call it that, is still sadism, just with the subject's own ego as the focus, instead of someone else's. A similar phenomenon can be found in the pair of scopophilia and exhibitionism. Here, there are three main stages, starting with the active act of watching an external object that defines the former proper. In the second stage, the main form of reversal leads to the scopophilic drive becoming passive. With this, another aim is set up, that of being looked at. Next, the final stage involves the introduction of a new subject that is able to watch the exhibitionist. However, as Freud goes on to say, this is still a bit too simple of a schema. The reason why is that there's an autoerotic preliminary stage that we're missing, one that doesn't really exist in sadism and masochism. To be a bit more specific, the first stage of scopophilia is based on looking at a sexual organ, which more often than not starts with one's own. This just isn't true with certain other drives, like the sadistic one. At the end of the day though, the differences just don't make up the essential point in Freud's argument. Instead, what the scopophilic drive reveals is that multiple stages can basically coexist. This preliminary stage, for example, is present in stage 1, just as much as it's present in stage 3, or exhibitionism. Nevertheless, this also isn't the only perspective possible. Instead, we can also represent their relationship as one of a succession of waves. The first of these eruptions happens as is, whilst the next are modified in some way or another, for example being passive rather than active. These collide and add to each other, shifting the drive's dynamics as new characteristics are incorporated. It's through this development that we find phenomena like ambivalence, which here refers to the coexistence of seemingly contradictory or oppositional drive impulses, like active sadism and passive masochism. At this point, Freud writes,
This reference to the developmental history of drives and the permanence of their intermediate stages should make the development of drives fairly intelligible to us.
In order to sketch this out, he relates that the earliest stages of ego development are described as being narcissistic, insofar as they involve the sexual drives being autoerotic. Charting the stages of a scopophilic drive, it starts out as such a narcissistic formation during the preliminary phase, although it ceases to be so when it becomes active, just to regress once passive. At the end of the day, the structure of the ego is the deciding factor when it comes to the activity or passivity of the drives themselves, with Freud going so far as to say that they bear the stamp of a narcissistic stage. Taking a bit of a step back, we've only really looked at one kind of reversal. So far, we've neglected changes in content and the way love turns into hate. This is quite a vexing issue in our author's eyes, since love doesn't really fit as nicely into our schema when compared to things like sadism and masochism. There are numerous reasons for this, starting with the fact that it actually has three opposites instead of one. Obviously, there's love versus hate. However, there's also loving versus being loved, alongside love and hate versus indifference. To understand the three, Freud points us towards three polarities that organize our mental life. Those are the ego and the external world, pleasure and unpleasure, and activity and passivity. The first and most fundamental follows from the way organisms come to distinguish between the inside and the outside through stimuli. The second, on the other hand, deals with feelings and plays a major role in organizing our actions. Finally, the third concerns the drives themselves, and is linked to a later division between masculine and feminine, a somewhat problematic coupling on which Freud says,
"The coupling of activity with masculinity and of passivity with femininity meets us, indeed as a biological fact, but it is by no means so invariably complete and exclusive as we are inclined to assume."
When it comes to the interactions between the three polarities, Freud focuses first on the primal link between them, found in the narcissistic stage of development. Here, the ego is cathected or invested in by the drives in an autoerotic manner. What this means is that it coincides with interest, whilst the external world doesn't matter at all. This is what holds the key to the last set of antitheses we looked at earlier, where love is opposed to indifference. If, for now, we associate the first term with the relationship the ego has to a source of pleasure, then there's no reason for it to care about outside objects during this stage. However, once the ego or self-preservation drives kick in, the situation becomes a bit more complicated. No longer can the organism be completely self-absorbed. Instead, due to the unpleasured experiences as emanating from the inside, it must take on outside objects. Here, two processes come into play: introjection and projection. Under this way of what Freud calls the pleasure principle, these describe how the ego absorbs sources of pleasure and expels those of unpleasure, respectively. The result of these procedures is a movement away from the so-called irreality ego of the first stage, towards a pleasure ego that concerns itself with the second antitheses, love and hate. Whilst the reality ego simply deals with the distinction between inside and outside, the pleasure ego instead divides up the world into negative and positive parts. Because of the way these are incorporated or dispelled through introjection and projection, we find another instance of the polarities coinciding. The ego is linked to pleasure, whilst the external world is linked to unpleasure. However, the germ of this opposition was present even during the preceding phase. To borrow Freud's words,
Indifference falls into place as a special case of hate or dislike, after having first appeared as their forerunner. At the very beginning, it seems, the external world and what is hated is identical.
As we move from primary narcissism to what he now calls the object stage, the second antithesis is essentially grafted onto the last. Moving on, Freud says that there aren't really any problems with saying a drive loves an object. There's something it needs to accomplish its aim after all, something that it is attracted to. Where it gets murky is with hate. This comes down to the fact that this side of the dyad deals with unpleasure and the build-up of stimulation, which drives themselves add to as discussed earlier. With this in mind, Freud says that it's more accurate to describe love and hate as attitudes held by the ego as a whole towards objects. Moreover, as he goes on to state,
We do not say of objects which serve the interest of self-preservation that we love them. We emphasize the fact that we need them.
Following from this, our author argues that love is explicitly linked to the sexual drives, albeit with some being sublimated and engaged in non-sexual things. However, there is a fundamental dissymmetry here between it and hate. The latter has no real direct connection with sexuality. Instead, only unpleasure matters. We detest what produces it in us without any regard for its source. Freud identifies its prototype as stemming from the ego drives, like those of hunger, thirst, and what have you. In this way, the love-hate dyad is actually much more complicated than it first appears. Concluding the essay, he now turns to describing their genesis. He begins with love, which he says originates from the ego's ability to satisfy the sexual drives autoerotically. It is only gradually that this shifts from narcissism to outside objects, involving a number of different phases. To start off with, for example, the oral stage involves the aim of complete incorporation or introjection. The loved object is a target for being devoured, since that abolishes its separate existence from us. Freud characterizes this as ambivalent, and tells us that it's only during the genital stage that love becomes the opposite of hate, being where all the sexual drives fuse together. Moving on to hate itself, he says that this is specifically linked to the ego drives and the organism's distinction between its external and internal worlds, both of which precede love. It isn't really all that uncommon to have conflicts between self-preservation and sexuality, which leads to an antithesis between the two sets of drives, which mirrors that of love and hate themselves. These conflicts, alongside holdovers from earlier phases of psychosexual development, explain why the latter two often coexist and give the appearance of reversing into each other. Ending the entire work is on this note where Freud states,
We may sum up by saying that the essential feature in the vicissitudes undergone by drives lies in the subjection of the drive impulses to the influences of the three great polarities.
Having now explored some of the features that define drives and their dynamics, it's with this that I'd like to conclude. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, I think that we will be continuing our new book, Character Analysis by Wilhelm Reich. Until then, bye!